In the highlands between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, there exists a land that has never belonged fully to any empire, yet has been shaped by all of them. A land where mountains rise like ancient fortresses, where valleys carry the echoes of armies long gone, and where every road seems to lead not just across geography, but through history itself. This is the Caucasus, and at its heart stood a kingdom that would one day astonish the medieval world. But before that moment, before triumph, before expansion, before the rise of a ruler unlike any other, there was struggle. There was near collapse. To understand Tamar, you must first understand the world that made her possible. Because great rulers are never born in isolation. They're shaped by crisis, by culture, by the weight of everything that came before them. In the 11th century, the Caucasus was not a place of stability. It was a frontier, a meeting point of civilizations that did not always meet peacefully. To the west lay the fading power of the Byzantine Empire. To the south and east, the Islamic world, dynamic, expanding, and politically complex. From the north came the steppe, vast, unpredictable, and home to peoples whose mobility made them both allies and threats. Georgia existed at the intersection of all of this, and for a time, it seemed unlikely to survive. The arrival of the Seljuk Empire changed everything. They came not as a single wave, but as a force that reshaped entire regions. Their expansion across Persia, Anatolia, and into the Caucasus was swift and devastating. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ruin. Agricultural systems collapsed. Trade routes shifted. Entire populations were uprooted and scattered. The balance of power that had defined the region for generations was broken. The decisive moment came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. There, the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Anatolia, once the heartland of Byzantine strength, was open to Turkish control. The political order of the Eastern Mediterranean began to unravel. And for Georgia, the implications were severe. Without a strong Byzantine buffer, the pressure from the Seljuks intensified. Raids became invasions. Invasions became occupation. Georgian towns were burned. Villages abandoned. The fragile unity of the kingdom began to fracture under the strain. For many observers at the time, the future seemed clear. Georgia would fall. It would become another territory absorbed into the expanding Islamic world, its identity diluted, its independence erased. But history is not written only by the powerful. It is also written by those who refuse to disappear. The Georgian people were shaped by their land, mountainous, resilient, difficult to conquer, and even more difficult to control. Their society was not centralized in the way larger empires were. It was a network of noble families, regional powers, and deeply rooted traditions. At the center of this identity was something even stronger than politics: faith. Georgia had been one of the first nations to adopt Christianity as a state religion. This was not a recent development or a superficial change. It was ancient, deeply embedded, and inseparable from what it meant to be Georgian. The story of Saint Nino, who brought Christianity to Georgia in the early 4th century, was not just religious history, it was national memory. Christianity in Georgia was not just belief, it was identity. It unified nobles who might otherwise compete. It connected the kingdom to a wider Christian world. And perhaps most importantly, it provided a framework through which suffering could be understood, not as defeat, but as trial. This mattered because survival at this moment required more than military strength. It required cohesion. It required purpose. And out of this period of crisis, a transformation began. It did not happen suddenly. It was not a miracle in the traditional sense. It was something more difficult and ultimately more powerful. It was deliberate. It began with a king. David IV of Georgia came to the throne in 1089, at a time when the kingdom was still under immense pressure. He was young, only 16, but the challenges he faced were those that would have tested even the most experienced rulers. What made David extraordinary was not just his ambition, but his understanding. He understood that survival required more than resistance. It required transformation. He began with the military. Rather than relying solely on traditional forces, he expanded and diversified the army. One of his most significant decisions was the integration of steppe warriors, particularly the Kipchaks, into Georgian service. These were not just additional troops. They brought new tactics, mobility, and strategic flexibility. It was a calculated risk, and it worked. But David's reforms did not stop there. He strengthened the administrative structure of the kingdom, improving taxation, governance, and coordination. He brought the church into closer alignment with royal authority, not to weaken it, but to unify it with the state. He understood something that many rulers of his time did not. A strong kingdom is not built only on the battlefield. It is built in institutions. It is built in systems. It is built in the ability to endure. And endure Georgia did. Slowly, carefully, David began to push back, not through reckless confrontation, but through calculated campaigns. He avoided unnecessary losses, chose his battles wisely, and built momentum over time. Then came the moment that would define his reign. In 1122, after years of preparation, David captured Tbilisi. This was not just a military victory. It was a statement. Tbilisi had been under Muslim control for centuries. Its capture symbolized not only territorial recovery, but cultural and psychological resurgence. David made it his capital, and in doing so, he sent a clear message to his people, to his enemies, and to the wider world. Georgia was no longer on the defensive. It was rising. By the time of his death in 1125, David had transformed Georgia from a vulnerable kingdom into a regional power. But perhaps his greatest achievement was not what he conquered. It was what he created. He established a model of kingship that combined strength with intellect, authority with vision, and power with purpose. He supported scholars, encouraged cultural development, and understood that a civilization's legacy is not measured only in territory, but in what it builds. This legacy mattered because it did not end with him. The generations that followed inherited not just a stronger kingdom, but a direction. They expanded, consolidated, and refined what David had begun. The Bagratid dynasty maintained continuity, navigating internal challenges while preserving the foundations of growth. By the mid-12th century, Georgia was no longer fragile. It was stable. It was ambitious. It was ready. And into this world, this carefully rebuilt, strategically positioned, culturally vibrant kingdom, a child was born. Around 1160, in a royal court that balanced ceremony with calculation, faith with politics, tradition with ambition, Tamar entered history. She was not born into chaos. She was born into possibility. But possibility is not destiny. Because even in a kingdom that had grown stronger, certain assumptions remained unchallenged. Power, it was believed, belonged to men. Leadership, it was assumed, required masculinity. And yet, history was about to test those assumptions in a way no one fully expected. Because the child born into this world would not simply inherit a throne. She would redefine it. She would take the legacy of David the Builder, not just preserve it, but elevate it beyond anything he had imagined. And in doing so, she would force an entire world to confront a question it had never truly answered. What happens when power takes a form it was never designed to accept? Her name was Tamar, and the world she was born into was about to change forever. Tamar of Georgia was born into strength, but not certainty. By the time of her birth, the kingdom of Georgia was no longer a collapsing frontier state. It had been rebuilt, reorganized, and reimagined by the legacy of David IV of Georgia and those who followed him. Its armies were capable, its administration functional, and its cultural identity deeply rooted. But stability does not erase expectation. And expectation, in the medieval world, was clear. Power belonged to men. Tamar's father, George III of Georgia, ruled a kingdom that was strong, but politically delicate. The Georgian nobility, powerful and deeply entrenched, did not simply obey the crown. They negotiated with it. They influenced it. And when necessary, they resisted it. The king's authority depended not just on power, but on balance. And into this balance, Tamar was born as the only surviving heir. This fact changed everything, because in a world where succession defined stability, the absence of a male heir was not just a personal matter. It was a political problem waiting to unfold. George III understood this, and unlike many rulers of his time, he did not attempt to solve it by replacing his daughter. He chose to prepare her. From an early age, Tamar's life was shaped not by limitation, but by intention. Her education was deliberate, structured, and unusually comprehensive for a woman of her time. She studied theology, not casually, but deeply. In medieval Georgia, theology was not abstract philosophy. It was the framework of reality. To understand theology was to understand legitimacy, morality, and authority. She learned languages, Georgian, Greek, Armenian, allowing her to move across cultural and diplomatic boundaries with ease. This was not merely intellectual enrichment. It was preparation for rule in a region where communication could determine alliance or conflict. She observed administration, how decisions were made, how resources were managed, how authority was projected. She learned the rituals of court life, the symbolism of power, the mechanics behind the throne. But beyond all of this, Tamar gained something far more valuable. She witnessed power. George III did not keep her distant from governance. He brought her into it. She watched negotiations unfold. She observed how nobles were managed, not just through command, but through persuasion, reward, and calculated restraint. She learned something essential. Power is not simply held. It is maintained. The Georgian court itself was a world of complexity. Centered in Tbilisi, it was not isolated or provincial. It was connected economically, culturally, and diplomatically to a broader world that stretched across Byzantium, the Islamic states, and beyond. Merchants passed through its markets. Scholars gathered in its institutions. Diplomats moved between courts, carrying messages, alliances, and ambitions. Tamar grew up in this environment, where ideas, beliefs, and strategies intersected. She was not sheltered from it. She was shaped by it. By the time she reached adulthood, Tamar was not simply educated. She was prepared. But preparation alone was not enough, because the real challenge was not whether she could rule. It was whether others would accept that she could. In 1178, George III made a decision that would redefine Georgian history. He crowned Tamar as co-ruler. This act was extraordinary, not just politically, but conceptually. In the medieval world, female sovereignty was rare and often contested. Women could hold power temporarily, as regents or caretakers, but rarely as primary rulers. George III rejected that limitation. Tamar was not crowned as queen. She was crowned as king. This distinction mattered. The title of king carried authority that could not easily be diminished. It removed ambiguity. It forced recognition of her position as equal, not subordinate, to any male ruler. But titles do not eliminate resistance. They provoke it. The Georgian nobility was divided. Some accepted Tamar's elevation, recognizing her preparation and legitimacy. Others saw opportunity. A female ruler, they believed, could be influenced, controlled, perhaps even overshadowed. They saw weakness where there was none, but they did not yet know that. When George III died in 1184, Tamar became sole ruler, and immediately the pressure began. The nobles moved quickly, attempting to formalize their influence by establishing an aristocratic council. This was not merely advisory. It was an attempt to limit royal authority permanently. It was a challenge. Direct confrontation at this moment would have been dangerous. Tamar was newly crowned, untested in sole rule, and facing a political class accustomed to power. She did not respond with force. She responded with intelligence. Instead of rejecting the nobles outright, she engaged with them. She negotiated. She listened. She allowed the appearance of compromise while gradually building her own network of support. She strengthened alliances within the nobility. She deepened ties with the church. She reinforced her legitimacy not through declaration, but through demonstration. This was not weakness. It was strategy, because Tamar understood something critical. Authority is most secure when it appears natural. The Georgian Orthodox Church became one of her strongest pillars of support. In a deeply religious society, divine legitimacy carried enormous weight. By aligning herself closely with the church, Tamar transformed her rule into something more than political authority. It became sacred. To oppose her was not just to challenge a monarch. It was to challenge the will of God. This was powerful, and it worked. But even as she stabilized her position politically, another challenge emerged, one that could not be solved through negotiation alone. Marriage. In the medieval world, marriage was never private. For a ruling monarch, it was a political institution with far-reaching consequences. A husband could become co-ruler. A husband could influence decisions. A husband could reshape power entirely. The Georgian nobles proposed a candidate, Yuri Bogolyubsky. He was of noble lineage, physically imposing, and politically advantageous. On paper, he was ideal. Tamar accepted the marriage, but reality did not match expectation. The historical accounts describe Yuri as unstable, prone to violence, and lacking the discipline required of his position. Whether entirely accurate or partially shaped by political narratives, one fact is clear: the marriage failed. What Tamar did next was unprecedented. She divorced him. In the medieval Orthodox world, divorce was possible, but for a ruling monarch, especially a woman, it was extraordinary. This was not just a personal decision. It was a declaration. Tamar refused to allow her authority to be compromised. She chose sovereignty over convention. Yuri was exiled, but he did not accept his removal quietly. Twice, he returned with armed support, attempting to reclaim power. Twice, he was defeated. These rebellions were not just personal conflicts. They were challenges to Tamar's legitimacy, tests of whether her authority could withstand direct opposition. She answered them decisively, and with each victory, her position strengthened. The doubts that had surrounded her began to fade, not because society had changed its assumptions, but because reality had disproven them. After this, Tamar made a different choice. Her second marriage was not imposed. It was selected. She chose David Soslan. This decision was strategic in ways her first marriage had not been. David Soslan was not an outsider. He was raised within the Georgian court, familiar with its culture, its politics, its expectations. He was a capable military leader, and most importantly, he understood his role. He was not the king. Tamar was. This balance was rare. In most medieval contexts, marriage shifted power away from female rulers. In Tamar's case, it reinforced her authority. David Soslan commanded armies, but Tamar commanded the kingdom. This distinction allowed her to operate within the expectations of her time, while quietly redefining them. Their marriage produced heirs, securing dynastic continuity. Stability was no longer in question, and with that stability came something else. Freedom. Freedom to act beyond survival. Freedom to expand. Freedom to transform. By the time Tamar had secured her throne, defeated internal opposition, navigated political pressure, and redefined the terms of her own authority, something remarkable had happened. The question was no longer whether she could rule. It was how far her rule would reach. The kingdom she inherited had been strengthened. The position she occupied had been secured. The challenges she faced had been overcome. What remained was possibility. And Tamar was not a ruler who would leave possibility unrealized. She stood at the threshold of something larger than stability, something greater than recovery. She stood at the beginning of a golden age, and the world beyond Georgia's borders was about to feel it. By the time Tamar of Georgia had secured her authority at home, the world beyond her borders had begun to change in ways that few rulers could fully grasp, but she did. Empires that once appeared unshakable were fragmenting. The vast structure of the Seljuk Empire, which had once threatened to overwhelm Georgia, was no longer a single, unified force. It had splintered into competing states, rival dynasties, and ambitious warlords, each more concerned with internal conflict than coordinated expansion. What had once been a wall had become a field of fractures. For a ruler with vision, this was not chaos. It was opportunity. Tamar understood this with remarkable clarity. She inherited a kingdom that was stable, organized, and militarily capable. But stability alone does not create greatness. It creates the possibility of greatness. And Tamar chose to act. The Georgian military, shaped by reforms that dated back to David Georgia, was one of the most versatile fighting forces in the region. It combined heavily armored cavalry, drawn from the Georgian and Armenian nobility, with lighter, highly mobile units influenced by steppe warfare traditions. Among these were the Kipchak warriors, fighters whose speed, archery, and maneuverability brought a dynamic edge to Georgian strategy. This was not a single-style army. It was a system, flexible, adaptive, effective, and under Tamar's reign, it would be tested repeatedly. Though Tamar herself did not lead troops in a battle in the traditional sense, her authority guided every campaign. Her strategic decisions shaped the direction of expansion, while her consort, David Soslan, executed them in the field. This partnership allowed Georgia to operate at full capacity, political intelligence directing military precision. The campaigns began cautiously. Georgia did not rush into reckless conquest. It expanded methodically, targeting key regions, responding to threats, and exploiting divisions among neighboring powers. Victory came not as a single dramatic moment, but as a pattern. Then came the first defining triumph. In 1195, Georgian forces met a major opponent at the Battle of Shankar. The enemy, led by a powerful regional ruler, posed a serious threat. But the outcome was decisive. The Georgian army achieved a comprehensive victory. The battlefield was not just won, it was dominated. But what followed mattered just as much as the battle itself. Among the spoils were Christian captives, people taken during earlier conflicts and held in bondage. Tamar ordered their release and return. This was more than mercy. It was symbolism. It reinforced the idea that Georgian expansion was not just political, it was sacred. That victory was not merely about land, but about restoration. This narrative mattered deeply in a society where faith and identity were inseparable. And it strengthened Tamar's position not only as a ruler, but as a divinely favored one. But Shamkar was only the beginning. The true test came years later, in a confrontation that would define Tamar's reign. The Battle of Bayan. This was not a regional skirmish. It was a major conflict against one of the most powerful forces in the region, the Sultanate of Rum, led by a ruler determined to challenge Georgian dominance. The scale of the threat was immense. A coalition force, large and confident, moved against Georgia with the expectation of victory. According to historical accounts, the Sultan sent Tamar a message before the battle, demanding submission. The tone was dismissive. The assumption was clear. A woman could not withstand what was coming. But Tamar did not respond with fear. She responded with preparation. She entrusted her cause to faith, mobilized her forces, and sent her army, led by David Soslan, to meet the enemy. The battle that followed reshaped the balance of power. Georgian forces, using a combination of disciplined heavy cavalry charges and agile flanking maneuvers, disrupted the enemy formations. What had been intended as an overwhelming invasion became a collapse. The coalition army broke. The Sultan barely escaped, and the message sent across the region was unmistakable. Georgia was not vulnerable. It was dominant. Bayan was more than a victory. It was confirmation. From that moment forward, Tamar's kingdom was no longer seen as a rising power. It was recognized as one. The consequences were immediate. Rival states reconsidered their strategies. Some chose confrontation and failed. Others chose diplomacy, alliance, or submission. Georgia's influence expanded beyond its borders, not only through conquest, but through recognition. Tributary states emerged. Regional rulers acknowledged Tamar's authority. The kingdom's reach extended across the Caucasus, into parts of Armenia, and toward the edges of Anatolia. This was the high point of Georgian expansion, a moment when geography itself seemed to align with ambition. But territorial power alone does not define a golden age. If anything, it only creates the conditions for one. What truly distinguished Tamar's reign was what happened within those borders. Because while armies moved outward, something equally powerful was developing inward. A cultural transformation. Under Tamar, Georgia became not just a political force, but an intellectual and artistic center. The Orthodox Church played a central role in this transformation. Monasteries were not only places of worship, they were centers of learning, preservation, and creativity. Manuscripts were copied, translated, and illuminated with intricate detail. Theological debates were conducted with sophistication. Scholars engaged with ideas from across the Christian and Islamic worlds. Knowledge was not isolated. It was cultivated. Architecture flourished. Churches and monasteries were constructed with remarkable precision and beauty, structures that combined spiritual symbolism with artistic ambition. Among these, places like Galati Monastery became centers of intellectual life, often described as academies where philosophy, theology, and science intersected. And then there was Varzea, a vast complex carved into rock, a city within stone, reflecting both engineering brilliance and spiritual devotion. These were not isolated achievements. They were part of a larger pattern, a civilization expressing confidence, a society investing in permanence. And at the heart of this cultural flowering stood one of the greatest literary works of the medieval world, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, written by Shota Rustavelli. This epic poem was more than literature. It was a reflection of the age itself. Its themes, love, loyalty, honor, friendship, were expressed with depth and elegance. Its characters were not simplistic heroes, but complex individuals shaped by emotion and duty. It represented a shift, from survival to expression, from necessity to creativity. A kingdom that produces such a work is not merely stable. It is thriving. It believes in its future. And, perhaps most importantly, it understands itself. Tamar's court became a gathering place for thinkers, artists, and scholars. It was not just a center of governance. It was a center of culture. This duality defined her reign: strength and refinement, power and beauty, expansion and creation. But even in this golden age, challenges remained. The nobility still required management. Internal tensions did not disappear. They were controlled, balanced, and redirected. Tamar's genius was not in eliminating conflict. It was in containing it. She rewarded loyalty, negotiated where possible, and acted decisively when necessary. She maintained authority without constant oppression. She ruled with presence, not distance. And through this, she achieved something rare: stability within expansion. As her reign progressed, Georgia reached its greatest extent. From the mountains of the Caucasus to the edges of neighboring regions, from fortified cities to cultural centers, the kingdom stood at its peak. Not just geographically, but historically. This was the Georgian Golden Age, a period where military success, political intelligence, and cultural brilliance converged. And at the center of it all stood Tamar, not as a symbol, but as a force. A ruler who understood her moment and shaped it completely. Yet even as this golden age reached its height, history was already moving forward. Because no golden age lasts forever, and what comes after greatness is often shaped not by what was achieved, but by how it is remembered. When Tamar of Georgia died around 1213, she did not leave behind a fragile kingdom teetering on uncertainty. She left behind something far more enduring: an idea of power, an idea of identity, an idea of what Georgia could be at its absolute height. Her death, though inevitable, did not feel like an ending in the traditional sense. It felt like the closing of an era so complete, so self-contained, that it would resist comparison for centuries to come. The circumstances of her final days remain uncertain. The historical record, unusually detailed in many aspects of her reign, becomes quiet at the moment of her passing. There is no dramatic final speech preserved, no clear account of her illness, no definitive location of her burial. This silence is not accidental. According to tradition, Tamar was buried in secrecy, her resting place deliberately concealed to prevent desecration by enemies. Even in death, she was protected, hidden within the land she had ruled so completely. And in that absence, something powerful emerged. Mystery. Because a ruler whose tomb cannot be found becomes something more than historical. She becomes symbolic. Her physical presence disappears, but her memory expands. The transition of power after her death was, by medieval standards, remarkably smooth. Her son, George IV of Georgia, ascended the throne without the violent succession struggles that so often followed the death of a monarch. This alone was a testament to Tamar's governance. She had not only ruled effectively, she had prepared continuity. But the world beyond Georgia was changing in ways that even her extraordinary foresight could not fully anticipate. A new force was rising in the east. The Mongols. The expansion of the Mongol Empire would sweep across Eurasia with a speed and intensity unmatched in medieval history. Kingdoms far larger and more powerful than Georgia would struggle, and often fail, to withstand it. The Golden Age Tamar had built was not designed for this new kind of threat. No kingdom was. And so, in the decades after her death, Georgia would face challenges that would gradually erode the stability and dominance she had achieved. Territory would be lost. Influence would diminish. The balance of power would shift once again. But here is the crucial point. The Golden Age did not disappear. It transformed. It moved from reality into memory. And memory, in many ways, is more powerful. Because it cannot be conquered. It cannot be burned. It cannot be rewritten by force. Instead, it becomes a standard, a reference point, a reminder. For Georgia, Tamar's reign became exactly that. Every ruler who followed her was measured against her, and almost always found lacking. Not because they were weak, but because the standard she set was extraordinarily high. She had achieved what few rulers ever do. She had aligned military success, political stability, cultural brilliance, and personal authority into a single, sustained period of excellence. This combination is rare, and it is rarely repeated. But Tamar's legacy extended far beyond politics. It entered culture. It entered identity. It entered belief. One of the most enduring expressions of this legacy is the continued reverence for the knight in the panther's skin by Shota Rustavelli. Written during her reign and dedicated to her, this work became more than literature. It became a cultural foundation. For centuries, it has been read, recited, memorized. It is taught to children. It is quoted in moments of celebration. It is treated not simply as a story, but as a reflection of what it means to be Georgian. And through it, Tamar's era continues to live. Her image, too, has endured. In the frescoes of Vardzia, she appears not as a distant figure, but as a presence, calm, composed, authoritative. She is depicted with the full symbolism of rulership, surrounded by religious imagery that elevates her beyond ordinary kingship. She is not merely remembered. She is honored. And this honor took on its most profound form when she was canonized as a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church. This is significant because sainthood is not granted for power. It is granted for holiness. To be both a ruler and a saint is rare. To be remembered as both, centuries later, is extraordinary. Tamar's faith was not an accessory to her rule. It was central to it. Her governance, her decisions, her public image, all were framed within a deeply religious worldview. And this integration of faith and power shaped how she was remembered. She was not just a successful monarch. She was a righteous one. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tamar's legacy lies in how she redefined authority itself. In a medieval world structured around male dominance, Tamar did not attempt to fit into existing limitations. She bypassed them. She was crowned as king, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a political reality. And over the course of her reign, she proved that the title was not misplaced. She commanded armies. She negotiated diplomacy. She managed nobles. She expanded territory. She governed effectively. In every measurable way, she fulfilled the role of a king. And in doing so, she created a precedent that could not be erased. This did not transform Georgian society into a modern understanding of equality. The structures of medieval life remained largely intact, but it did something equally important. It created proof. Proof that leadership is not inherently tied to gender. Proof that ability can override expectation. Proof that history, when forced, can expand its own boundaries. Centuries later, this proof still matters. In modern Georgia, Tamar is not just a historical figure. She is a symbol of national identity. Her image appears on currency. Her name is invoked in cultural and political discourse. She represents a moment when Georgia stood not at the margins of history, but at its center, a small kingdom positioned between empires, achieving a level of power and cultural sophistication that commanded recognition. For a nation that has often faced external pressure, invasion, and political complexity, Tamar's legacy provides something invaluable: perspective. A reminder that greatness is possible, that strength is not defined by size, that identity can endure even when circumstances change. Historians, poets, and scholars have returned to her story again and again, not because it is simple, but because it is layered. Romantic interpretations emphasize her beauty, her grace, her almost mythical presence. Political analyses focus on her strategic intelligence, her management of power, her ability to navigate complexity. Modern perspectives highlight her as one of the most significant female rulers in world history, a figure who did not just hold power, but reshaped its meaning. All of these interpretations are valid, but none of them alone capture her fully. Because Tamar exists at the intersection of all of them, she is historical and symbolic, political and spiritual, real and idealized. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Because it does not belong to a single category. It belongs to history itself. When we look back at her reign, we are not just looking at a sequence of events. We are looking at a moment when multiple forces aligned: circumstance, preparation, intelligence, opportunity, and produced something rare. A golden age. And at the center of that age, with a ruler who was never meant to exist in that role. A woman crowned as king, who did not ask for acceptance, who did not wait for permission, who did not redefine power through theory, but through action. She ruled for nearly 30 years. She never lost a major war. She expanded her kingdom to its greatest extent. She presided over a cultural renaissance that still defines Georgian identity. And she did all of this in a world that expected her to fail. History, in the end, did not remember those expectations. It remembered her. And it remembered her in the simplest, most definitive way possible. Not as queen, but as king. Because in every way that mattered, that is exactly what she was: